Welcome, everybody, to the sixth Displacement Solutions webinar on innovative approaches to climate displacement that we're holding in honor of the 10th anniversary of the Peninsula Principles on Climate Displacement within States, which were approved in August 2013. Tonight, we're speaking about the question of institutional responses and state responsibility as it relates to the question of climate displacement with a panel of very esteemed experts from different disciplines and different institutions, mainly located in Europe. Throughout our 18 years of existence, Displacement Solutions has worked very extensively on this question of climate displacement. And we've always taken the approach that as new as this form of displacement is, we also need to equally be creative and innovative in our responses to it. Not only obviously were these issues not included within the various international legal frameworks that were developed 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, but the very nature of this form of displacement is fundamentally different in very important ways than the traditional forms of displacement that we're used to grappling with, whether the ones caused by conflict internationally and internally, refugee flows, and then down the road to treatment of IDPs. We need to recall that, in the early years of the international refugee and displacement machinery following Second World War, there was little to no attention paid to the question of internal displacement. And this took actually many, many decades for the international community to respond in such a way that principles were developed and institutions were developed. It took almost half a century, really, before the guidelines on internally displaced persons were approved and subsequent institutional measures were undertaken to begin to provide protection to that very large group. And similar ways of thinking can be applied to the question of climate displacement. As we know, climate displacement in its totality will dwarf other forms of displacement in the world today, whether caused by disaster or conflict or any other cause. We are talking at a bare minimum of 200, 300, 400 million people, up to perhaps as high as one of our speakers tonight has estimated 3.3 billion people, nearly half of humanity, will be forced to leave the homes in which they're living today due to circumstances which they did not cause and which are beyond their control. So, in our opinion, climate displacement, broadly defined, is probably the most ubiquitous, the most large-scale challenge and crisis facing the entire human race today. And we are woefully unprepared for it. There is not enough political will to do anything about it. There's not enough financing. There's very little planning that's taken place, and far too few innovative solutions to actually prevent it from occurring, and when it cannot be prevented, resolving it in the most humane, dignified, and human rights consistent manner possible. So over the years, beyond our work on putting the Peninsula Principles together, which are a set of principles that can guide states to deal better with the question of internal displacement because of climate change, which is at the moment the overwhelming majority of people who are displaced try to stay within their borders if they can. We've been pushing the line of new land for lost land, new homes for lost homes in countries around the world where we've worked, 30 or 40 different countries on these issues, and having that as the sort of rallying cry for people that are displaced by climate change. We've worked a lot on the question of land solutions for climate displacement. We found through really more than 10 years of research on various themes related to land that all we need is 0.14% of the Earth's land surface is enough land to rehouse the entire population of everyone who's displaced by climate change. Now, in a way, that's just a theoretical, esoteric number, but we came up with this number to show simply that it's not a question about a lack of land. There's more than enough land to go around. It's a question of access to that land and ensuring that access. So that argument that there is no available land really is to be nipped in the bud, with some very small exceptions in places like Tuvalu or Ontong Java Atoll or Tokelau or Kiribati or any number of the other atoll states. But there is enough land to go around. So we've also been pushing this idea of climate land banks, whereby every national government sets up a climate land bank and begins to identify land that it can hold in trust, removed from the commercial sector, and then allocated to communities who need it, in the event that they're no longer able to stay where they are. We've proposed in a recent report the need to establish climate displacement ministries in every national government in the world, and we've gone into great detail in designing what such a ministry would do, the functions it would have, the amount of staff, etc. We teach the first ever law school course on human rights and climate change, which has been around now since 2007. And we've done an increasing amount of work on climate litigation. One of our recent reports, we discovered that far less than 1% of all of the world's climate cases, there's over 3,000 now that have reached different courtrooms in all the world, less than 1% of those have anything to do with climate displacement. So it's very, very rare on the in the judicial realm to actually address the question of climate displacement in courtrooms. The vast majority of those cases deal with much broader issues of CO2 emissions and things of that nature, but very little has yet been really adjudicated when it comes to climate displacement. And that's part of the issue that we want to get at today. Once again, that question of where does the role of the state begin? Where does the role of the individual begin? And what are the actual legal requirements? We're planning actually to ourselves engage in a major international test case on the actual legal duties of states vis-a-vis climate displaced people, and that process is underway at the moment. And then finally, before giving the floor to the first speaker, we're really encouraging people everywhere on this panel and beyond to think of workable, innovative solutions to really tackling this question head on. And so we've been engaged with a whole range of these options. I'll just name a few now. The whole question of floating neighborhoods, it sounds outlandish and absurd, but there's a growing number of neighborhoods in the world, including in Amsterdam, for instance, a very famous one called Schoonschip, which is, obviously a Western country that's highly advanced and wealthy, but nonetheless, an entire neighborhood part of Amsterdam is built on floating pontoons, basically. I think it's 60 or 80 houses now, something like that, as a means of preventing displacement down the road. And they rise and fall with the seas. There's discussion underway now that I've had with several agencies here in the Oceania region, the Pacific, of placing floating platforms right off the coast of some of the larger cities in the Pacific, to which public infrastructure can be transferred, so that the public infrastructure needed energy generation and things of that nature, banking, what have you, can be made safe, even if the land itself cannot be. There's floating villages under construction in the Maldives right now, just as one of countless examples, once again by a Dutch firm, where I think they're housing approximately 20,000 people on the outskirts of Male, the capital, as a real long-term, not forever, but somewhat longer than the immediate term solution for some of those people. Discussions have been had in Tuvalu and a number of other atoll nations of literally raising the level of the land 4 meters, 6 meters, 8 meters, to actually allow them to stay longer as sea levels rise around them. And even here, where I'm speaking from, which is on the edge of a bay called Port Phillip Bay outside of Melbourne, discussions have started about what to do with the fact that just on our little bay, which is the one that goes all the way up to Melbourne from the ocean, by the end of this century, damages are expected to exceed $550 billion. So just here in this little teeny part of the world, the damages are going to be astronomically high. And that has led people to begin proposing super radical solutions, such as blocking off the entire entrance to the bay, which gets its water from the ocean, with a Meuse-like barrier, like the barrier that's in Venice, or the Thames River barrier, or the various barriers that exist in Holland, as one way of protecting a city of 5 or 6 million people. So there's a lot of thinking underway. There's a lot of innovation going on right now in various sectors. Some of it completely unrealistic, obviously, for most of the developing world in terms of the cost. And that very much needs to be borne in mind. And finally, before we begin, obviously we should shoot for the stars as human rights people, that everybody everywhere should be able to get what human rights promises them. At the same time, we have to be pragmatic and realistic, and particularly when it comes to the housing, land, and property rights dimensions of climate displaced people. We can probably count the success stories on one or two hands. Very few governments have ever satisfactorily housed their entire population, even in the best of times. So how do we do that in the worst of times, in a time when so many people in so many countries, every country in one way or another, are affected by climate change and ultimately climate displacement? So with that, I'm very happy to give the floor to Gaia Vince as our first speaker. And she's a leading author and one of my favorite writers who I read everything from. And so Gaia, please take the floor.
So it's a huge, huge pleasure to be talking to you today about what is, something that we are all going to have to wake up to. And effectively we have. I mean, if we look at the news, so I'm on one side of the world where we have had a ridiculous number of storms. I'm in Europe, I'm in the UK, and we've had one major storm after another causing terrible damage, floods, violent winds, which is to be expected for two reasons, partly because we have an El Nino phenomenon going on at the moment, but also because greenhouse gases, what they do is they trap heat in the atmosphere, and that extra energy gives storms much more violence and much more power. It affects wind speeds. It affects the hotter air is able to hold a lot more moisture. So then you get these deluges when the air releases that moisture. It affects the patterns of the Gulf Stream. On the other side of the world, where you are, Scott, there has been, record heat waves. I think the first wildfires started as early as September. Very, very unusual for Australia to be experiencing wildfires. Then we've had heat waves in the last weeks in the high 40 degrees, as well as major floods across the southern hemisphere. So last year, I'm just not to bang on about it, but last year, the average global temperature, right? Bearing in mind that we have had countless COP meetings, climate meetings now, saying, let's keep 1.5 alive, let's keep below 1.5. Well, the average global temperature last year was 1.48 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average. That doesn't mean we have passed it, because you have to have a decade of that, but it's an incredibly worrying sign. And we don't normally dip below once we've gone up. We don't dip below for any significant time. So we're heading upwards. The average land temperature, surface temperature in December was actually 1.8 degrees globally. 1.8 degrees above the pre-industrial average, significantly higher, as was the global sea surface temperature. And really what that means is, we've seen in terms of the global sea surface temperature, we saw, the Caribbean was like bathwater, and that has led to a speeding up of the almost certain extinction of coral reefs there, which is obviously a tragedy for the biodiversity there, but it also has significant fisheries implications, what people use to eat. So we have in the last few years experienced around the world really a a non-stop realization of the extreme weather conditions wrought by climate change. So there is nowhere now that can say that climate change is something that will be experienced in the future far away somewhere. It's happening in your own country, to people that you know, when they go abroad, to places that you know, and it's costing millions, sometimes billions of dollars to sort out. I mean, if you just think about Canada, that's been on fire, was on fire for most of last year. That led to huge amounts of infrastructure costs, as well as, you know, just the health costs of the filthy air that was felt as far away as America. You know, these are cross-boundary, cross-national. That these extreme weather events do not observe our invented geopolitical lines on a map, obviously, but it's worth spelling that out. This is a planetary disaster now. We are expecting to see temperatures continue to rise across the world as we continue to emit the greenhouse gases which trap that heat energy in the atmosphere. At the moment, if you look at where we're headed, we are aiming for somewhere between around 3 and 4 degrees above the pre-industrial average by the end of the century. That would render enormous parts of the world unlivable and beyond anything that humans have experienced, beyond the livability that humans have experienced since they built civilizations, since they developed agriculture and settled in this human-made world that we all need now in order to survive. We're not, nomadic hunter-gatherers in small populations that can easily move. We are, to some extent, fixed by this geopolitical, economic, industrial structure that we have developed across the world. And it enables our survival, our much higher standard of living, our much longer longevity, our longer lifespans, but it also traps us in various ways. So I spoke to scientists at the Met Office to compile a list of the multiple effects. So what we're expecting to see in terms of the climate science and as the global temperature goes up is an increase in events, an increase in the severity and the frequent events, but also multiple events across several areas. So at the moment, what we see is most climate displacement is internal. So it's therefore largely invisible to external players, to other nations, to the global picture. We don't see climate displacement in the way that we saw the migrations from, say, Syria during that war, or Ukraine and other places from conflict. What we're seeing is mainly internal at the moment. But increasingly, what will happen is that these events will be multiple. So we will see one event followed quickly by another event within the same nation, within the same region. And people will lose their ability, therefore, they lose their resilience over that, because they're still recovering from one event when they're struck by another. And we already see people being multiply displaced from one area to another. That it started really, in my experience of noticing this around the world, in places like Bangladesh, where people who were displaced from one area that had been flooded or experienced typhoon damage moved to another place where they were then displaced from there, and another place to the cities, perhaps, where they were then displaced by rising ingression of the seawater into the water table. So it comes up and they can't, there's no food, there's no agriculture, the sewer water is fouled, the sanitation becomes an issue and you get disease. So we get these cases of multiple displacement across nations, across regions. And that's the big problem, because nations then can't cope with that. And so we are expecting to see an area of unlivability extending across the tropics that tropical region. That's where the impacts will be the greatest. And when I say the tropics, in the Americas, it goes down, into sort of almost Patagonia and up into the Great Lakes. In the Euro-Asian region, it goes up. As far as Southern Europe has already lost, places like Spain, Portugal, they already have that Mediterranean climate has gone. It's a desert essentially, huge water losses, which is becoming these climate impact issues are becoming election issues, as we saw, I think, in the last Australian election. It will become increasingly a problem elsewhere. So Spain has huge water shortages, fire risk, Greece, Italy, southern Italy. And then all the way down through pretty much the whole of continental Africa in one way or another will experience these multiple impacts. In Asia, we're talking about, the subcontinent of India, large portions of China, huge amounts of drought, which cause power outages, affect agriculture. Agriculture is most affected by drought more than by heat. And then you get a loss of the economic output. And, we can't afford in Britain, in Germany, in Australia for the economy of China to fail. We are all interconnected. It is in all of our interests. All of our interests are aligned to dealing with this. Australia, of course, is right at the forefront of this. So I just want to talk very briefly about the issues I think that we have, which is, so first of all, the issues which I call the four horsemen of the Anthropocene, the issues that force people to move. They are fire, flood, heat, and drought. They either make a place unlivable because you can't do labor there. There are plenty of places around the world where people are already wearing head torches to work at night in fields or construction sites because it's too hot during the day. And of course, heat and humidity is a massive killer. And it looks like the threshold of survivability for heat and humidity, which is measured by the wet bulb temperature, is actually far lower than was previously thought. It was previously thought to be a threshold of survivability of 35 degrees of wet bulb temperature. And that survivability limit is for young, healthy people not doing active work. So, they would die within 6 hours at that survivability limit. That has now been reduced by studies to somewhere between 25 and 28 degrees of a wet bulb temperature, which is a huge problem because we're already exceeding that many places around the world now. Floods affect infrastructure, affect harvest, cause landslides. A huge problem, making people homeless. Drought, massive problem, especially for hydropower and agriculture again. And fire, we all know what the problem is there. We've watched with horror as towns have been reduced to complete ash and led to evacuations of climate refugees in various places from Greece to Hawaii. So this is a huge problem. Now, displacement, the refugee crisis, migration, all of that has traditionally been the field of sociologists, of disaster management, of NGOs that work in managing development and those issues. The problem I have found in my discussions across this is that generally there is the prevailing belief is that we can extrapolate back to migrations of the past that have been caused by occasionally a natural disaster or conflict, and we can just sort of therefore project forward and maybe add a little bit on for climate change. It might get a little bit worse. There is this fundamental lack of understanding generally in this field of climate science, and climate scientists are working on a very different basis. They are not doing this extrapolation because they know that we're already perhaps on our way now through step changes. This is not a linear extrapolation that we're facing. We are facing absolute step changes in the severity, in the scale, and the livability of what comes. So we are also facing tipping points, Earth system tipping points, which are extremely worrying and will massively affect livability again. So when I talk about tipping points, I'm talking about, the metaphor is I guess the straw that broke the camel's back or the donkey's back. So you go from one energetic state, the donkey's back being fixed, you add straws, you just add another little straw, a little bit more heat, and that one straw is enough to push the donkey into a completely different state, broken back. You can't just withdraw your straw and it bounces back and the donkey's back is fixed, of course. That is a different energetic state with very, very different properties. It's another stable state. We don't know. We haven't reached that stable state with the amount of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas molecules in the atmosphere. We haven't reached that yet. We don't know where that stable state is and what it will be. But we are facing an absolute step change in how these events will affect our small mammal species, and that is something that we need to get beyond. We need to talk about, because obviously the scale and the nature of this livability is not predetermined. We don't know whether it will be billions of people displaced or a few 100 million people being displaced. It depends on our emissions. It depends on how we adapt. We can adapt to a lot of unlivable conditions, but normally for small, wealthy populations, not for 8 billion people. Everywhere will have to adapt. So just to finish, what we need is an absolute narrative shift from leadership particularly, but from this area. We need to move to pragmatic realism. We need to move our heads out of these sort of manufactured culture wars and what might be politically convenient to talk about at the moment, and talk realistically about what we're facing, which is, we can't just ignore climate change or migration. Migration is completely natural, normal part of life, but this increase in immigration is coming. How are we going to handle it? It will depend on adapting everywhere, as we will have to. We need practical ideas for how to do this. We're not talking solely about the movement of people. We're also talking about the movement of capital, investment, expertise, infrastructure, industry, agriculture. And because of that, it also represents a huge opportunity as we go forward. If we do plan and manage this, we could build something which is better. We need to think much bigger. We need to think from a completely different perspective, and we need to have vision and imagination. And many of the ideas that we will hear, we will have to make decisions, difficult decisions about what to sacrifice, what to protect, because not everything is possible. But we have to think much bigger. And it can be difficult to imagine something very different without saying it's impossible, it's ridiculous. And so before I leave, I'm just going to say, we're talking about 2021, a completely different world of 3 to 4 degrees above the global average. Think back to 1924. That was a different world. There was no TV. There was, we'd just come out of the First World War. We still had empires. Many countries that exist today simply didn't exist. The world order was completely different. The entire world was an incredibly different world from now. There were motor cars, but they weren't the primary mode of transport. It was a very, very different world. They would not have imagined that within 15 years, a huge global war would shake everything up. There would be migrants, refugees, people moving from all over. The complete world order would change, and how the world will be now. Well, we can't see a lot of the changes that are possible in the future. We do, however, have much more information than they ever did about what the climate would be like. And that is something that we can work with. And I really hope we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gaia. I think what you said at the end there is, particularly poignant, um, because we don't usually look at the climate crisis as an opportunity for something good, building something good out of something bad. But I think from anybody, for anybody who's delved deeply into the climate crisis, we now find ourselves effectively at a 1648 moment in time at the end of the 30 Years' War in Europe, when they finally decided to conclude treaties of Westphalia, which led to the nation state structure that we still have in place today. It's like the 1945 moment, the end of the Second World War, and building a whole new infrastructure of global governance in the form of the UN Charter, which will turn 80 next year. We are at a similar juncture in history, and we can look at it as something that's going to destroy us all and, expedite Armageddon or similar outcomes, or we can use it as a force beyond the power of any individual person or government or coalition of governments to control, and see it as an opportunity to fundamentally question the way in which we allow ourselves to be governed. And is this the time, once and for all, to move beyond the system of Westphalia, for instance, that's been there almost, 350, 400 years, almost 400 years? Is it not time to begin to question the validity of that particular system in a world where every single person, notwithstanding their nationality or citizenship, is going to be affected by this phenomenon? This may be the last chance to kind of come together as the human race. I mean, that's the way I kind of approach it increasingly. This is the way we expedite the Socrates' plea to have a world of world citizens, or any number of people that have made that proclamation as cosmopolitans throughout millennia of history, who have said, Socrates said, I'm neither Athenian nor Greek. I'm a citizen of the world. That mentality now is probably infused in the minds of more people than any other single time in the history of humanity. But where do we gather? Where do we go to actually make that into something? It's much further than what the UN can offer as the alliance of states. It's much further than any pre-existing entity can offer us. And I think climate change almost forces us in that direction. And if we don't go in that direction, if we try to solve it on our own, so to speak, if we try to solve it as tiny little entities called nation states, we will just get into the scenario that, that other great historical figure, Thomas Hobbes, spoke about. The war, life will be nasty and brutish and short for everyone, and it will be a war of all against all. And that is, for ever dwindling resources. That's not the future we need. So we need to really get out of normal mind frames here. We need to transcend the normal way of viewing this particular problem as there's a cause, there's a pathway to solution, and then there's a post-solution phase. This is something much bigger than that. And, it may sound esoteric and dreamy and odd to some people to speak like this about a political or environmental crisis that we're facing. But, the more I work on this issue, for me personally, at least, it's really very much that sort of existential question. It's not just the existence of a nation state or of a coastal community, but it's really civilization itself. And I think, in your book and elsewhere, really drawn that out in a really good way. So thank you very much. Thank you. And so now I give the floor to Ricardo Safra de Campos.
And thanks, Scott and Kirsty, for your invitations. In a sense, I'm going to be taking a slightly different approach to this conversation, which is to bring some empirical evidence on migration and displacement, but particularly really looking at one of the potential outcomes that perhaps others have not done so yet, which is that migration and displacement will have an impact on sustainability and the way that we plan for sustainable development. And I think this is relevant given that the SDGs and the 2030 agenda is only about 6 years to come to its conclusion, and we have not seen yet many of those goals being fulfilled worldwide. So I think we could turn our attention to seeing how migration could be harnessed to bring about sustainability for countries and individuals. So this is just a look at the figures. I think most of us on this call will be very familiar with them. Migration has, in a sense, been steadily on the rise. We have around about 280 international migrants worldwide, 280 million international migrants worldwide. Of course, it's much harder to have a projection of internal migrants, obviously for the way in which migration is recorded. But we've seen that the trend is steadily going up in terms of percentage. We have roughly 3.6% of the world population being international migrants, and we're looking at stocks rather than flows in that diagram. But equally relevant, I think, is just to say that there is quite substantial displacement taking place associated with environmental hazards, some of which Gaia has already talked about. But how migration can be a transformative pathway to sustainability, which I think it is an important point to raise. Migration, and equally for those individuals that are displaced, there is a transformative opportunity there. If governments and institutions are willing to support that and in many ways. We're talking about economic opportunities for both migrants and countries or destinations. It could be, we're talking about international migrants, equally in terms of internal migrants, so internal mobility. Places could benefit from the skills that migrants bring to society. We're talking about cross-generational mobility. We know of the many diasporas and how migrants tap into social networks. So there could be opportunities for translocality livelihoods between members of the same family or household. And obviously, really, I think for many of us on this call, issues around identity, if individuals are displaced, having to be relocated perhaps internationally or even within the borders of countries. Migration and displacement is transformative. But if we're talking about sustainable development in a way that it has been formulated, which is sort of increasing well-being, enhancing well-being in an equitable manner for current and future populations, then we need to look into well-being outcomes. Are migrants and displaced individuals becoming better off if migration takes place proactively, and what's the difference between those that are able to move in sort of preemptively before certain environmental stresses make the places where they live inhabitable, or those that have been forced to migrate away or being relocated by countries or institutions. The key gap that we've been able to identify is that models of sustainability transitions really underplay migration and demographic transition. And this is likely to become more acute because of the increased displacement that is likely to happen because of climate change and environmental stresses. So if we look at how this relationship is, in a sense, it's been missed in terms of all those models that we have seen and we have discussed in the past, we see that there is a multiple as an interplay of relationships. Looking at the central panel there, where we have origin and destination, well-being capacities, and so individuals carry their own sort of skill set and capacities, and those really are associated with the way in which governance responds to certain stresses, to certain events, and the capacity the migrants might have to bring new skill sets, to innovate, to generate prosperity, destination, as well as in origin. There is something that we in migration literature and scholars talk about social remittances, which is something that perhaps remains under studied. All of us really talk about migrants being able to send financial remittances, send money abroad, or send money back to the families. However, there are skills, capacity, new knowledge that can be transferred between places. And this could actually, this sort of migration futures that we're talking about, could be transformative for societies. So even for those that are being displaced, I think one way that governments and institutions could respond is in a sense, make sure that the well-being of those individuals is being improved. And this is a critical determinant of outcomes. So particularly for countries that are likely to deploy planned relocation, for example, are those individuals that have been relocated better off in terms of well-being? And we're talking about not just economic and financial well-being, but subjective well-being, psychological well-being, those that have been essentially plucked away from their places of heritage, or where their livelihoods were, fisheries, and are being relocated to places where they have to learn a new skill set, become farmers or herders. So this has a multitude of impacts on their well-being. So this is something that has been missed in all these conversations about sustainability going forward. So the migrants can be a transformative force for sustainable development, and it's something that has been underplayed so far by policy. Next slide over, please. So all of this has been really published very recently. There is the article there where myself, along with colleagues, explore the relationship between migration and sustainable development, and how it has been really underplayed in all these debates around future displacement, migration associated with climate change. Perhaps this is something where the government, those that are generating policy, could put a lot of effort and emphasis in how to harness that potential that migrants bring about to new societies that they're moving to. Next slide, please. So the second point I wanted to talk about is really around decision making and sort of these million micro stories that happened, and to what extent we might be missing a critical element, which is those that individuals that are unable to move, that will be essentially become displaced, or then they will have to be relocated. So what are the intentions that those that can move and those that are unable to do so? So next slide over, please. We know the numbers. All of us here have talked about numbers. We've seen those numbers, how they changed in 2002 to the latest. I'm bringing attention to a 2019 article, 1.2 billion, but I think, Scott, you were mentioning something very recently in the region of 3 billion people being displaced. So the relationship is complex and of course is not unidirectional. So what we need to understand are two things. Most of that displacement happens within borders of countries, and how environmental change affect potential migration decisions. Next slide, please. So we conducted research over the last 10 years in deltas, so parts of the world that are critically really exposed to a wide range of environmental stresses. Those locations had been stratified by exposure to hazards. So we're talking about saline intrusions, cyclones, changes in rainfall season, monsoon season, droughts, and so on. And we interviewed households which had migrants and households that did not have migrants, just to get a balanced perspective. Next slide over. Principles, reasons for migration in households. We would assume that most of individuals that migrated actually did so because or had some kind of association with environmental stresses. It turns out that it's not, and that has been the case throughout the literature. This is consistent with literature. coming out from sociology, anthropology, human geography, demography. People, when asked about the main reason for migration, they tend to say that they're moving for economic reasons, for education, family obligations, and so on. So the environment was only really mentioned by 0.6% of all our interviewees. So people don't necessarily make that direct connection in terms of the reason why they're moved or displaced to an environmental stressor. Unless that environmental stressor is, of course, a sudden onset event like a cyclone, of course, people then are forced to essentially flee for their lives. So next slide over, please. But when asked about the impact of those stressors in their livelihoods, people do perceive that. They perceive that the environment is changing. They perceive that those environmental stressors have a critical impact on their livelihood, makes their livelihood insecure. And then we asked people about the main reason for future migration, and yet they are essentially talking about economic factors impacting that decision. So how do we, as researchers in the research community, try to really tease out the extent to which the environment is driving migration for individuals that can do so proactively? So what we do see, and we've conducted statistical analysis, but I'm not going to bore you with all those numbers, but rather just bring sort of a sense of overall results, that people's perceptions, how they perceive changes in the environment, is critical in terms of their future decision to migrate. So drought reduces intention to migrate because obviously for people to be able to move, they need to have certain resources, financial resources, the social networks that they can tap into it. If their livelihoods is critically impacted by an environmental stressor, that obviously reduces the internal resources available for individuals and households to migrate. And then this is across the 4 deltas in India, Ghana, and Bangladesh, and for a wide range of environmental stresses. So you can see how the perception of livelihood insecurity, perception of changes in environment impact people's capacity to move. And even future intention to do so. So again, in the past, most of migration driven by economic and education factors. We know that that climate change will cut across all those factors, impact people's livelihood, impact people's capacity to decide where to move. And all those relations, it's a complex web of relationships, will be mediated by how people perceive changes in the environment, but also how how governments intervene in terms of in situ adaptation, or how they will relocate individuals, will obviously affect their future intention to remain where they are or migrate away. So just coming to a conclusion. So there are 3 key points that I think is worth raising for policymakers, institutions, international donors, and governments. First, make cities safe. We know there are principles guiding how cities will respond to climate change, and we know that they can become safe havens. Migrants are likely to continue to migrate from rural, marginal hinterlands towards cities and look for better employment, education. So what we're suggesting and recommending is that cities prepare and take into account migration as part of urban planning, and specifically really in terms of how those individuals will use migration as a response to future climate change. Second point, plan for relocation. Planned relocation is likely to become to be deployed in parts of the world, Bangladesh, where we have done a substantial amount of research. It is actually built into the Delta Plan, the 100 years Delta Plan. So communities in the Delta will have to be relocated. So how to make that safe, take consultative processes, take people's own well-being, sense of well-being into how planned relocation is going to be deployed in the future. And the third point, facilitate international migration. There are mechanisms by which some individuals will perhaps choose or have the opportunity to migrate internationally due to existing diasporas and networks, but equally looking at the Pacific Islands, for example, where individuals from smaller islands like Tuvalu, Vanuatu might have to move internationally to Fiji, or in the case of Australia and New Zealand, where there are mechanisms actually in discussion that will offer visas, humanitarian visas for those individuals that will be essentially displaced because of sea level rise. So how the international global policy can make international migration one mechanism by which migrants can respond to climate change. So I will park here. Thanks for the opportunity, and look forward to having continue the conversation with all of you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ricardo. And just a couple of quick comments before we move to Andrew. It's good that you mentioned Tuvalu at the end there. It's also something for all of us to bear in mind. You know, I'm sure all of you have heard of this recent treaty that was concluded between Australia and Tuvalu, which was, you know, touted as an extremely significant thing. But I just want to make the point here very publicly that it's highly controversial in many quarters. It's not a panacea by any stretch. And beyond the issue of the facilitation of an already ongoing brain drain away from Tuvalu towards another destination, in this case, Australia. I mean, Tuvalu only has 11,000 people. Very few doctors, right? Very few nurses, very few engineers, very few mechanics, very few university educated people. And it tends to be those people who are going, obviously, to be the ones that go first. And that will have inevitable long-term consequences on the viability of that state. So in effect, one could argue, and people do argue, including probably half the population of Tuvalu, that treaty was not the greatest idea. Because it's simply going to mean that the balance has been shifted from 50.1% in favor of staying and fighting to 50.1% in favor of leaving and fleeing. And so that will have a spin-off effect, particularly in terms of investment and possibilities for further sustainable development, et cetera, for not just Tuvalu, but any of the small island nations. It's less of an issue for the larger ones. You know, Bangladesh, Vietnam, China, India, the other countries that are going to have 10, 20, 30, 50 million people leaving. But for the small island nations, these issues are fundamental. And it's really, you know, raising the migration side of the equation, you know, behooves all of us to, in whatever way we can, try to shift the narrative from the present, which is, you know, migration is bad, migrants are evil, horrible, blah, 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 all those Trumpisms that we constantly hear every single day. And particularly from a country that's benefited so much from migrants, and really try to, you know, grab the reins in terms of guiding public perception on migration and showing convincingly how much of a positive force it has been in almost every single country where it has occurred on a large scale, including the one I'm speaking from now, where we take in, you know, 250,000 people minimum a year out of a population of 26 million, with barely a peep of opposition from anybody, because both left and right sides of the political spectrum realize the benefits of this, you know. And that perspective, I think, needs to spread much more widely, particularly in countries now in Europe, unfortunately, which are using migration so much to facilitate the emergence of fascist and extreme right-wing governments. And that also, you know, brings up the additional issue of something we've been working on, of like promoting this idea of climate displacement havens. So using migration, climate displacement in particular, as a way of regenerating economic viability of rural areas in countries such as Italy, Japan, parts of Eastern Europe, which have lost populations over the recent decades, which are dying and declining, and turn those communities into entities that welcome and induce migrants to come to them as a way of revitalizing the local economy. And that's, I think, the sky's the limit on that issue. You know, we need to do much more on that. And then that, in turn, of course, facilitates a better impression of people about the whole question of migration. So still 96.4% of humanity still lives within their own borders, so it still remains a very, very rare thing that people, like many of us here today, have chosen to do, leave our own countries for different reasons, but it still remains the exception to the rule by far. We also need to, remember that that's only going to grow. So thank you very much, Ricardo. Now I'm happy to give the floor to Andrew Harper, who has the small task of being the UNHCR focal point for all matters related to climate change and climate displacement. So Andrew, over to you. Thanks again, Ricardo.
Okay, thanks, Scott, and thanks, everyone. I think it's what we're talking about is climate change, but what we need to be taking into account is something much bigger than that. It is the issue of climate change, but it's the issue of nature. It's the impact of biodiversity loss. It's the impact of desertification. It's the impact of all these threats that humankind is throwing at the existing environment, and that trauma that humankind is causing and continuing to contribute to is not surprisingly leading to these cascading or compounding disasters that Gaia was mentioning before. And so what is that leading to? That is, like, you've referenced climate and displacement, but it's much more than that. It's much more complicated. It's much more complex. And that's why you have so many challenges in determining what are the protection needs of populations who are moving, both internally within their countries, which is, as has been mentioned, happens every day, but also the numbers of people who are crossing international borders. And the numbers are huge. And you mentioned before, Scott, that it's only going to become increasingly apparent that this impact, the torture that humankind is doing to nature, is leading to basically the depopulation of areas, and we're already seeing that. There's a focus on small island developing states because it's easy to see, it's very picturesque, and people can look at Tuvalu or Kiribati or Marshall Islands, but it's happening across the world already. Like, if I spend a bit of time in the Sahel and East Africa, in Somalia, in Kenya, even places like Mozambique, and you're having depopulation. And why is that happening? People sort of say climate change, but we have to, again, be much more sophisticated in understanding the attribution of why people are moving. And as Guy was saying, like, you are having one disaster after another. And the ability of communities to resist in order to adapt, they don't have a chance. They literally do not have a chance to maintain the lifestyles and the cultures and maintain the communities that they've had for generations. And so they are being displaced. People sort of say, oh, that they're choosing this decision and there's free choice. They don't have a choice. These people are being displaced. And as soon as you start sort of trying to nuance it and sort of say, well, like, we've got migration, and migration is there, but there is also people starving. You've got famines. You've got people unable to maintain their existence. So you've got climate change, but I would dare say you've got biodiversity loss, you've got desertification, you've got acidification of the oceans. All these are leading to almost a groundswell, and you're talking about political changes in the past, but we're seeing global changes to nature and what we talk about security. And we're not necessarily talking about security in the kinetic sense. We have to be talking about security of the global systems as we know them. So you've got obviously threats to livelihoods. You've got threats to livelihoods because Guy again mentioned the wet bulb index. But before we even get to the wet bulb index, where you've got the challenges to humankind being able to remain in certain regions, you're going to have the crops dying. You're going to have the livestock dying. And so every living thing has got a tolerance. And it could be juvenile rice crops in South Asia. It could be cattle in the Sahel. It could be the changes to maize. It could be the increasing prevalence of pests. So climate change is igniting and accelerating all these additional threats. All these additional threats are then leading to challenges, as I mentioned, with livelihoods, over food, over water. And these in turn are then challenging the traditional systems of governance, because governments no longer have the capacity to provide the basic public services and meet their public commitments to the populations. And so in a number of areas around the world, you're seeing a retreat of traditional governance from the peripheries of the states back to the capitals. And so when you look at how we, and this is where we have to be going to solutions, when we look at the solutions, you have to understand better the world in which we're going to be confronted with in 10, 15, 20 years. Because only by understanding the real challenges and how all these planetary boundaries are being exceeded and what are the threats and increased vulnerability can you start working backwards to say, okay, what's required? And so there are some good examples out there, but those examples in terms of displacement have to relate to accessing safer areas. It is about regional agreements. You're not going to get new multilateral agreements. You're not going to get a different 1951 convention. That's just not going to happen. The world is not at that place. So our best bet is to be working with states which are being impacted to ensure that those most impacted states can be secured and be provided with support from regional entities. And so we've already got good practices with the OAU Convention, 969, also the Cartagena Declaration, 984. There's some good work in the South Pacific, but those regional institutions, mechanisms, super important. Then once we've got those regional sort of mechanisms, then we've got to try and figure out, okay, how can we get the funds to those locations? And we can't be focusing on anything which is too complicated because that's just not going to work. So we have to be looking at how do we include those people who are most vulnerable? And obviously from UNHCR, we focus on refugees, but it doesn't, if you look at refugees here, you could also put indigenous populations, you could put in migrants, you could put in like anyone who's vulnerable. So we need to ensure that when there are policies and plans and strategies, that they're inclusive of the whole of society. And the broader these policies and plans, the more likely that they're going to be addressing the wider shocks. Just as climate does not differentiate between borders, people will also move in order to find the safest place. So we need to ensure that the policies and plans of countries and regions are integrated. So it's not just talking about this sort of climate catch-all type thing. We need to be focusing on the national adaptation plans. We need to be focused on the nationally determined contribution plans, the disaster risk reduction strategies and early warning. And you might think that, yeah, it's already happening. It's not happening. It's not happening because people are not being ambitious enough or demanding enough to do the simple things. And the simple things are, don't waste time putting in place strategies which are completely defunct. To give you an example, I was doing a lot of work in the Sahel. There's 29 strategies on securing peace in the Sahel. 29. But if you try and get a common system of understanding of what the needs and indicators are in the Sahel, you can't get them. So we've also, I said we did some work. We didn't do the work, but the OECD did some work. IFRC's done some work. PDD's doing work. We're trying to have a better understanding, for instance, of the national adaptation plans to see how many of them include displaced persons. And out of the 49 national adaptation plans, there was about 6 that included refugees, and only 2 of those actually had policies related to the implementation of adaptation for refugees. So 2 out of 49 are valid. But we're not going to be able to get countries to do the right things in terms of addressing displacement unless there is funding. And this is where the big issue is. Where do you get the money from? The Green Climate Fund is not up to speed, is not delivering the funds as is required in a timely manner. We've had a very good relationship with the World Bank in terms of getting funds out the door. This has to be accelerated. We have to find out how, and this is again far beyond my mandate, but when you've got fossil fuel companies making $4 trillion a year, and we've got countries saying that they don't have the money, then there's obviously something not working there. It's pretty simple. And this is where we're having a talk before. The political will has to be there. We are focused on actually ensuring and reducing the vulnerability of populations, or we're focused on ensuring the profitability of fossil fuel companies. It's $4 trillion a year is disgusting. So how do we translate the funds that are available? Don't tell me there's no money out there, to getting it on the ground. And so this is where we have to be working with the big banks, where we need to be working with the communities on the ground. We need to simplify the grant process, and we need to just be questioning people. Like when people say they're doing something, are they actually doing something? So there was some figures which came out just the other day. Well, actually, I put them out because there was IFRC figures, but the figures came out, and it was like they looked at the 30 most vulnerable states to climate and conflict using ND Gain Index and Inform. Those 30 most vulnerable states, not one of them was in the top 30 as far as receiving climate adaptation financing. Again, like how do we allow this to happen? Why, like at every bilateral meeting that everyone has with a bank or with a government, because don't tell me that the governments who are board members, and this is all the ones who we generally deal with, could be Norway, could be the US, could be the UK, could be Sweden, whatever. They're also on the boards of these big banks. And so we should be trying to encourage them to say, look, it's not just the problem of the issue of multilateral development banks or IFIs. We can convince these banks to loosen up their lending arrangements so that they can give more money to those fragile and conflict affected states and ensure that those funds get to the communities on the ground. If you don't have that, then nothing's going to change. But at the same time, we also need to focus on what are the projects which are worth investing in. Because I'm also of the opinion that there is funding out there. There is a willingness, particularly from some elements within the philanthropic area, to invest in climate and vulnerable communities, but they're also not going to do it twice if they cannot see the impact and the results. So working together towards having a common understanding of what the threats and opportunities are in the future, trying to understand what is blocking the billions of dollars which is required to get out the door, is what's super important. And this is why we work so closely with our colleagues, whether it be with ICRC and IFRC and PDD and the World Bank and research institutes, because we've all got a common objective here. How do we reduce human insecurity so people are not put in more vulnerability? So I'll leave it there, but happy to answer questions or be involved in the discussion after this.
Great, Andrew. Thank you very much. Very insightful on many fronts. A couple of things that could also be sort of added to that list is the whole question of degraded land. Degraded land is a greatly underappreciated problem in the world. Depending on which agency you believe, it's anywhere between, I think, 22 and 38% of the Earth's land surface is officially and formally declared to be degraded. So we've been pushing the idea, for instance, of trying to, revitalize that land, rejuvenate that land as a potential, relocation point for people that are losing the land that they have that they're living on now, and in the process, not just regenerating the land, but also increasing biodiversity in the area. So, once again, using a negative to create a positive. And, this whole discussion, everything you said is completely valid, but we once again need to view it in the context of the way in which we as a civilization have chosen to live and the economic systems upon which we have decided to allow ourselves to be governed and to enjoy prosperity in life. And once again, depending on who you read, Jamie Hickel, others work on inequality, etc. For everybody to achieve the lifestyle that all of us on this call have is going to require at least 3.8 Earths. And as far as I know, we only have one. So when we start looking at solutions to this question, we do need to bear that very much in mind. It's structural, deep, and worsening inequality, and the inevitability of increased competition for the limited and very finite resources that exist on our one planet. But it's not a question, again, of a lack of resources, just as it's not a question of a lack of land. It's a question of will to do it. And I think people working in this field, we all need to be increasingly clever in terms of trying to nudge things in a direction whereby these resources can be garnered and used for purposes that they're not being used for now. So thank you again, Andrew, and congratulations on a challenging job in a big, huge institution on on the most important issue facing humanity today. So I'll give the floor to Jim now from the HLP cluster group. And thank you again, Andrew, for that great presentation.
Thanks, colleagues. So I work with the Housing, Land and Property Area of Responsibility. So I'm one of the co-coordinators on behalf of Norwegian Refugee Council. We also have co-coordinating colleagues from UN Habitat. So we're working together to help try and support the coordinated response to humanitarian emergencies and crises, and sort of advocate and provide inputs and energy and resource around housing, land and property issues as they come up. So it's a very kind of, it feels very specific and niche when I think of the things that have been talked about already by Andrew, Ricardo, Gaia and Scott. But I want to sort of acknowledge that, for us, we're responding as humanitarians. We respond to things, and I think one of the big questions is, how do we get better at being prepared? How do we get better at thinking about what we might do prior to response, either to minimize and reduce and take away the need to respond, or at least to minimize the impact of crises when they come. So I also want to sort of situate my comments also in the ongoing discussions around the aid system, the humanitarian kind of structures that exist. There's all sorts of discussions and debate around sort of decolonization, the way aid flows, the amounts of money that go from north to south, etc., and the need to kind of shift and ask some real serious, significant questions around that. So I just want to say that as I suppose a sort of a caveat or a context for all of this that follows. So I'm going to respond kind of in two ways to these rather massive questions. Firstly, thanks for being, for inviting me to join. It's great to be able to listen and learn, and then to, I guess, offer some kind of, responses to some of the immediate need that we're seeing, and just offer some ideas around how we're looking at that and maybe where we might need to go. So I think there's two kind of big things to look at. One is, as humanitarians, as the humanitarian system, we too often get stuck in our silos. We too often get stuck in that sort of emphasis on a response. So, we sit and we wait for something to happen, and then we respond to that. And of course, that's a massive simplification and not fair to great work that's being done. But as a whole, that is how we're set up. So there's a real kind of challenge and a lot of debate, and some real good ideas coming through around how we shape the system up, how we make sure we're working well with local communities, with governments, across the whole UN system, with other organizations, but bringing together those that are working on a response, platform and premise, but also those that are working for longer term, development and also work around peace and conservation and all these kind of things that we need to see much more kind of joined up in terms of how we think about some of the particular challenges that people are facing. So I'll talk a little bit to that, and then I want to just suggest as we go some approaches and practices that I've seen through the work that colleagues are doing that maybe have quite a narrow focus and are responding in a shorter term, but maybe offer something that we can be looking at in the the coming years as we help those that are impacted by what is happening and changing that we already see. So I think that's part of the conversation as well. We might be looking 20, 30 years, but we're seeing impacts now, and we're seeing things change for people than maybe what we've seen before. So just briefly on housing, land and property, it's one of those humanitarian sort of acronyms that can be a bit of a nightmare. What does it mean? Well, essentially, housing, land and property rights. I mean, I feel kind of strange saying this with Scott here hosting the call because, yes, anyway, but so this, but for everyone else, but housing, land and property rights drawn from international law, the right to adequate housing. They're about what makes it possible for people to live on land and use property. So in humanitarian responses, we're often thinking about how do people have a home free from the fear of forced eviction, a place where they can be safe, it offers shelter, and that they can secure some kind of livelihood. And so that might be while they're away from a home that they want to return to. It might be when they've resettled or in a new space. But how can they have that safety, security, and dignity to be able to live a good life? And worth noting, it's sort of beyond private sort of ownership and ideas. It's about protection for all. So not just those who own a property. It's about those who have some kind of engagement with housing land. It's for all people. It might also include like rights to use land and buildings as well. And it is beyond ownership. It's about overlapping rights in some situations. It can be very complex and confusing and requires a deep kind of engagement with the context and what's happening. We often see as well, these things being discussed at the household level, but it's also about thinking about communities, about the links and access to natural resources, use of land for agriculture, livelihoods, and also infrastructure that might support dignified living, for example, water and sanitation as well. And we see, as you can imagine, where people stay, where they live their lives is at the heart of displacement. It's about the heart of how we might respond to displacement. And again, so, part of our work is to try and advocate for people to consider these kind of wider questions. How can we make sure the land and the houses that people are staying in can be as safe and secure as is possible, and that they can be, the risk of things like them being evicted and displaced and moved on can be minimized. And so, we see this as a sort of a golden thread that goes right from any kind of planning and thinking, a humanitarian response, but as we think about longer term solutions as well, how can people's security and connection to the land that they are on be magnified and emphasized? So that's a kind of as a catch-all. And we see that climate crisis and the changes that are coming from that are sometimes exaggerating and exacerbating existing vulnerabilities. Sometimes it becomes a sort of mutually reinforcing situation. So we hear the threats of nature that Andrew mentioned. We hear Guy, you mentions the fire, flood, heat, and drought. And then we see those things linked to conflict, and those things interact. And we see a number of situations around the world where some of those sort of triggers, those things that happen are kind of conflated and create these kind of wicked problems that have multiple layers and need are very difficult to respond to. And we see immediate impacts, so rapid events that happen, and we also see the slow onset impacts of climate change as well. So there might be, as has been mentioned, coastal erosion, drought, desertification, and that can lead to all sorts of challenges. And then there's extra hazards that people might face when they are displaced. So, it's maybe not that surprising, but sometimes when people have been displaced, they don't always get offered, the best land to stay on. They might be facing challenges that the land that people who are trying to host them or want them to stay on might be at risk of floods, landslides, droughts. I mean, I've seen a number of situations where, land might be proposed by an authority or whatever, but it is not suitable for living on in a safe way. So that can be a real problem. Climate change and the impacts from it can also prevent return. So some of the obstacles to people being able to go home might be, rising and remaining water. So we've seen floods in South Sudan, for example, hurricanes in Honduras, which have a significant long-lasting impact in terms of just the presence of water. We see rubble after sort of earthquakes and other events linked to nature in Afghanistan, Syria again, which might not allow people to return. Of course, we see land disappearing completely, like in Bangladesh. We might see erosion making it land uninhabitable, and we see that in some places in Mozambique. Repeated drought, low rainfall levels has impacted Iraq, Somalia, South Sudan, other places as well. Of course, rising sea levels, meaning people literally are losing the possibility to return to the land that they once lived on. And desertification impacting countries like Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, South Sudan again. So we see these kind of conflict, climate change, disasters coming together, exacerbating existing risks to populations, undermining the ability that people have to adapt, impacting their ability to be resilient. Guy, you mentioned kind of repeated extreme events and that not allowing people to sort of recover. And it impacts, food, water, the ability to sustain livelihoods, and of course forces people sometimes to be displaced again and again and again. And we would argue that, in each of these scenarios, secure access to land, property, natural resources, both at the place, at the place where people are displaced to, as well as for considerations of whether or not they might be able to return or move on, is key to the survival and key to how we look to more effective longer term solutions. So I guess one point that's been raised already, maybe this pushes us to move beyond the sort of new normal way of doing things. It pushes us to think beyond business as usual. Change feels incredibly slow, but I think things are changing. We're starting to get a better handle, a better view on how, as a humanitarian sector, we think about the links between climate change, the crisis there, as well as longer term environmental concerns. And I think as aid flow is increasingly less sustainable, I think there's big challenges all around. We have to think more smartly about how we work together and how we make better connections. Already on this call, hearing the work of the previous speakers, I'm aware that there's connections that need to be made and fostered and developed. So I'm really thankful for this context to be able to have these discussions. I think one thing that comes as part of this is that when we're thinking about housing, land and property, I mean, these are intrinsically local kind of impacts. These are where people are living. It's about how people organize their communities, and so we need to again keep pushing for the response and the sort of decisions and the leadership to come from national and local actors, and we still don't do that enough. And I'm as guilty as anyone else. I think as part of that, we need to sort of increase and understand better what's going on. So the analysis needs to be better at integrating these different aspects, and I think we're making some steps towards that. I'm part of various discussions around how we understand humanitarian need and severity and all of these things. And we're starting to see better attempts at linking those things together. But I think, one of the big questions we have to ask is, are we asking the right questions when we're choosing how to plan and how to respond? We talk quite a lot within the humanitarian space around this sort of nexus between humanitarian development and peace actors. And there's lots of thinking and ideas around that, but I still think we're looking to see that have a real impact. And again, we all kind of agree that it's needed, but how are we going to see certain of us give up the space and the sort of, I suppose, the power to make sure that we can have the best impact we can? So how do we respond? What possibilities are there? Well, there's the changing the system, I guess, which is something I've sort of alluded to, but goes way beyond my remit and pay grade, sadly. But I think coming as a humanitarian into this discussion, how can we link better with the other work that's being done? Discussions around loss and damage, discussions around various responses. I mean, it was interesting to see at COP much more of a humanitarian presence. Some people have seen that as a bad thing. Other people have seen it as a positive. So I think there are connections being made, and we need to sort of push them more. Again, how do we work and think about natural resources and people's access to natural resources? I don't think as in a humanitarian response context, we always do that well, and we can do more on that. How do we prepare and almost, if we can see, sadly, that events are becoming more likely. So we know droughts are going to hit certain places. It's very likely again and again. How can we make sure we're understanding and recording land tenure rights agreements so that we can have those things in place beforehand? How can we make sure our data and analysis allows us to do that? How can we think about boundaries that change because floodwaters are there and maybe landmarks that we use to mark boundaries shift? Well, what can we do to make sure we're understanding who has access and connection to certain land, especially now if it's at more risk from being uninhabitable in the future? And I think a key part of that is how do we make sure we build in and get really good at dispute resolution, like actually finding ways to have decent dialogue, decent engagement, and processes that really honor and understand and listen and find collaborative, collective ways forward. Because in all of these contexts, we're having to face challenges that many people haven't faced collectively together. So we need better ways of doing that. So in conclusion, I think I would just say I don't feel like I have any, big ideas that kind of get us to where we need to get. And I love hearing some of the ideas that are being discussed already today. But I think one of the key things is to make sure we're having more of these connected, joined up conversations, but that think about how these properly have an impact. So, and I think part of the way we start that is through our analysis, but we have to think more about how we integrate these questions, for me, around housing, land and property, but I see how they link to so many different issues right across kind of how we prepare and get ready to respond, and how we can do things on the kind of policy and the practice side that allow us to have some things in place ahead of time for when these increasingly common events linked to climate crisis happen. So that's where I guess I'll lead it. A plea for we work with local and national actors, and that we have to think as well about the experience, particularly of women, in terms of the impact of this on them, because the climate-related hazards, I think, heighten pre-existing vulnerabilities. There's a lot of research around this, and for women, they are particularly impacted by that. So we must make sure we kind of prioritize that in terms of how we're thinking about our responses as well. Thanks for the opportunity and for having me.
Thank you very much, Jim. It just raises two issues that are directly relevant to the HLP equation, which aren't often taken into account. The first is the whole question of insurance and climate insurance in particular. It's obviously only relevant to certain portions of the world in realistic terms, but even here in Australia, we've had severe flooding in recent years in certain areas. Now they're estimating that somewhere in the range of 10 to 20% of all the land and housing that was once insurable is no longer physically insurable. So that's just one example that I can give for the whole world. There's a lot of other cases like that. So it's literally no insurance company is even going to offer you a policy to get your money back if you're affected by a fire or a storm or a flood. So that's just something to weave into the whole world of tackling climate change. And then also just the warning that as more and more land is inundated, as more storms hit, as more coastal areas are threatened, we need to be constantly vigilant against the land grabbing that will be sought to be achieved by nefarious actors in this context. And as Zeke and I have worked on together in the Philippines and in Sri Lanka and in a range of other countries, following either storms or tsunamis, governments put in place policies along coastlines that they would have never ever had the possibility of putting into place had the event not occurred. So they try to achieve through other means things they could never achieve during normal times. So there was a 100-meter no-build zone put into place in Sri Lanka, for instance, following the tsunami there, the Great Boxing Day tsunami, and eventually kind of overturned in the end. Same within the Philippines, but nonetheless, this phenomenon will occur more and more. Climate change will be used by nefarious actors as a pretext for displacing populations that are living in vulnerable areas, even though they don't need to move. And we need to constantly be on the guard for that. So thank you again, Jim. And now, second to last speaker.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation and for hosting this extremely interesting gathering. And the reason I need to go back at 12 is I've just stepped out of a workshop that's taking place just 20 meters down the corridor on protracted crises and complex emergencies. And we're on day 3, which is developing the action plan, which is the important but something I think Andrew was alluding to or saying directly, and also Jim hinted at, or maybe said a bit stronger, is one of the themes that is coming out of that workshop is that the humanitarian system is under incredible strain at the moment. We are moving from disaster to disaster to disaster to complex emergency to overlapping emergencies to compounding crises. And communities are not having a chance to solve one crisis before another one is hitting them. And we have colleagues in the room from Afghanistan to Nigeria to Democratic Republic of Congo to Myanmar who are just simply overwhelmed. We have donors in the room who are recognizing that they are unable to keep pace. So we, as humanitarians, I like that phrase, Jim, we can do our bit. But as Andrew said at the start, so much of protracted crises, complex emergencies, so much of this issue, Scott, is about political willingness. And we are just not seeing it writ large. And I think that is an extremely important context for this specific conversation. So that's the first thing. And that's unfortunately why I have to run back and develop these action plans. But I have the benefit of listening to all of this wisdom rather than sharing the little wisdom that I had. One of the things I wanted to recall was, of course, Kirsten, the invite said that this is the 10th anniversary of the Peninsula Principles. And something I wanted to recall was 10 years later, how prescient the Peninsula Principles were in a lot of regards. And I wonder, Scott, if it was a case of being too early, and actually what would it look like to have the same process now? Not only in terms of what the Peninsula Principles say, but also how they were developed. And I think some of the process was critical, and it's a lot of what we've talked about now. This need for an integrated approach, bringing legal experts with NGOs, with UN colleagues. I think the Red Cross wasn't there at the time, Scott, but probably would be now. And even extremely, as you said, Jim, local actors. We had, of course, the CEO of IPSA, Young Power and Social Action, who had come from Chittagong, Bangladesh. He was completely amazed at this process of drafting these Peninsula Principles and the specific negotiations over language. But having him in the room the whole time and just that metric of like local perspective and responsibility and accountability that came with that. So the how they were developed, I think, is as critical as what they said. It now seems obvious and based on the conversation, but the focus on movement within states was actually counter the kind of dominant focus at the time with Nansen, etc., Atla, which was really about movement across borders. And to really focus on internal movement at the time was not the mainstream perspective, I guess, that we might have now. Jim, communities were put very much at the center of those principles. They were recognized as needing to play a fundamental role in any solutions that were coming. Housing, land, and property was there. And even amazing for me today to look at them again before this, even putting the issue of loss and damage 10 years ago at the center of this conversation, I think was extremely prescient. The second point I was going to make is in the 10 years since that cold August in Red Hill, Mornington Peninsula, I think what we've done is help to unpack some of the complexity around this issue. And one of the challenges I think we have is that there are so many intersections between these two megatrends of climate and migration, population movement, that sometimes people are coming with particular areas of focus or institutional bias or mandates or otherwise, that we're not always necessarily identifying the same problem to solve. And what I mean is, for us, a big focus, of course, is climate contributing to new movements of population, loss of land, other extreme events that are contributing to new movements. But also, of course, we could equally talk about people who already moved and are now facing new climate risks. And of course, Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh is probably the most direct example of that. People moving for reasons not really connected to climate, but now in one of the most climate vulnerable places on earth. Or even as organizations that work on humanitarian issues or migration issues, displacement issues, what is our role in our activities and interventions in addressing climate? And so there are all of these different intersections. Often in group discussions like this, we tend to touch on all of them. They are all complex. They are all quite different. They're all connected to these macro issues. But I think really identifying the specific problem that we are trying to solve and address is something that is not always there in our conversations. The other point I was going to make was that a lot has happened in the last 10 years, and we've heard a lot about that. The Task Force on Displacement was established under the UNFCCC and under the loss and damage mechanisms. The Global Compact for Migration, I'm sure Atla will talk about this, now has substantive language related to climate and disasters. The Global Compact for Refugees addresses this issue. COP decisions have been made. The Global Platforms and Disaster Risk Reduction, the regional platforms are all addressing this issue in a way that we did not see so front and center 10 years ago. For us, I think there's an ongoing question of a specific approach, like the Peninsula Principles, versus a more integrated approach. And how do we find that balance? Is it that We need a specific document framework approach that addresses this issue, or do we see it as part of all of these other issues? And integration itself can be radical, but also there's that classic trope of if you mainstream something, it can be invisible as well. So I think that's an ongoing question, maybe a need for evaluation of which of these various initiatives at the global, regional, and national level have actually led to change for communities. Another reflection was in those 10 years since the Peninsula Principles, my feeling is that there is a real momentum now on this issue, and I think we need to capture it. It definitely goes up and down. One metric is always probably for all of us, how many students are contacting you, asking for interviews and perspectives on this issue. There's a lot at the moment, but I'm also getting a feeling, which I think is important, that when I give answers, students, young people, new people to this issue are saying to me, to others quite clearly, you are not doing enough. The impacts are outpacing the modeling. A line in a COP decision is not going to solve this problem. These integrated approaches are great, but we might need to do something more radical, more different and faster. And then finally, just on what we are doing as the IFRC network, this is one of the hardest issues we have to deal with today. I have many national society colleagues around the world who come to me and say, Zeke, we don't know what to do. When we go and talk to a community in the Solomon Islands and they bring up this issue, we don't know what to say to them. We don't know how to help them. We have 191 national societies. We have 16 million volunteers, and they're not just national actors, they're local actors. There are 125,000 branches of the Red Cross and Red Crescent around the world. And what we want to do this year is move from the evidence base, the policy base, to what that local action looks like. So we will have a lot of consultations with our network this year and other partners to develop ultimately local plans for communities at scale. And what we want to do is answer the question for communities that if we do our part of mobilizing funding and support for you, what do you as a local actor, what do you as a volunteer in your community need to do differently tomorrow to help your community? And we need to help get you the funds to be able to do that. But we also need to be able to answer that question. If you are a volunteer in Kiribati, if you are a volunteer in Bangladesh, if you are a volunteer in Mali, Honduras, what do you need to do and what can you do differently tomorrow, and how can we support you to do that? Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you, colleagues, for the time and important opportunity.
Thank you, Zeke. As always, a great presentation. Two things that it reminds me of. First of all, we're doing a lot of stuff now on the with the people from Ontong Java Atoll in the Solomon Islands, the world's biggest atoll and the most isolated. So there's a whole range of complex issues related to their potential relocation. But I'm going to contact you next week or the week after to just to fill you in on all the details. And then secondly, trying to encapsulate all you said into, one phrase. We tried to sort of do that a year or two ago with one of our publications, which we called "On Whose Door Do We Knock?" We tried to encapsulate down what is an actual climate displaced person, what's the first thing they're going to ask when they face this crisis? On whose door do we knock? And, the bottom line is most people, most places have no clear answer to that question. Not only do the institutions not exist, but even the ones that do exist to provide some degree of assistance, they're not helping enough and they're not capable of helping enough. So I think that's one way to kind of try to, encapsulate all of these multifarious issues into one essential question through the lens of the eyes of that one person. Where do I go for assistance in my own little situation? And, as you said, 125,000 local chapters, et cetera. That's one place where people may possibly turn. So thanks very much. And then finally, we give the floor to the mighty Atle.
Thank you, Scott and Kirsten, for inviting me. So since this is recorded, I wanted to say a few facts. I work for the Platform on Disaster Displacement, the PDD, and we are set up to follow up to the Nansen initiative that has already been mentioned, and the Nansen initiative agenda for the protection of cross-border displaced persons in the context of disaster and climate change. So like the Peninsula Principle, the protection agenda is another tool we can turn to. And one aspect of the protection agenda is that it was endorsed by 110 states in 2015. I also want to recall that when we started in 2013 with the Nansen Initiative, we drew also from the Peninsula Principles and took a lot of inspiration. So I think we also started at the same time and really learned from you, Scott, and colleagues. And although we had a focus on cross-border dimension of displacement and human mobility, we quickly learned that there is an internal dimension to this to look to, particularly for the managing of risk, prevention, and mitigation of impact. So I also want to use this opportunity to tell you that the Peninsula Principle has been an inspiration for our work. Kirsten asked us to not dwell too much about the past and the problem statement, but also what do we do about climate and disaster-related displacement, and what should be our priorities going forward. So what I wanted to share with you today is that the Platform on Disaster Displacement, we have just issued a new strategy, 2024 to 2030. And maybe you will say that I take advantage of this moment to present the strategy, but it essentially spells out what we think is important. It spells out what will be our priorities. I think it will be helpful for this discussion, at least hopefully. And also just to recap that the Platform on Disaster Displacement, we are state-led. So we have 18 member states in our steering group, and IOM and UNHCR are standing invitees. So as Andrew said, we work very closely with both the High Commissioner and IOM in our work. And we also have an advisory committee. At the moment, we have Kenya as our chair. And that means that what I'm saying is a little technical and maybe timid. As a political scientist, I would have loved to talk about the Westphalia outcome and how there might be alternatives, but I'll be a bit more technical and timid. But I think some of the big questions you are asking, Scott, are very important. It's about the economic system, the state system, and how we organize ourselves. That also needs to change. So just going into our strategy, a few assumptions, and I think we all have talked about them today, that displacement related to climate change will grow. We have strong evidence from the IPCC, and we heard from Gaia that this is not a problem that will, or a challenge that will go away. We have another assumption that it needs stronger engagement. We are woefully unprepared, and we need more resources. We need more policies. There are gaps across the board. So we are facing a future for which we are not prepared. And maybe my third point is a bit related to what we heard from Jim and maybe lately from Siki, is although there is increased attention in the international system to the issue of disaster displacement, also climate related, the system or the aid system struggles enormously with coordination and coherence. And one issue is, of course, that it sits across different areas of climate change, disaster risk reduction, humanitarian, human rights, displacement, migration, and refugees. So it hasn't been able to come together. And I think what you said, Scott, and I remember you said this in 2013 in a meeting we had, whose door do you knock on? What's the institutional setup? What's the predictability there? And I think that's something where we see still a role for PDD, that there is an institutional or a need for stronger policy integration, and there's an institutional challenge. And maybe finally, an assumption we are having for our strategy is that there is need for more evidence, data, and awareness. And I think that's also related to the narrative. And I think we shall be very careful about the narrative we are using in this area. It's very complex, and it can easily be seized by politicians. We know that the former Prime Minister of the UK used climate change as a scaremongering phenomenon for reducing migration, for example. So I think we should be careful about numbers, projections, and really lend justice to the complexity. So our strategy 2024-2030 as a key objective still about protecting and strengthening protection of people that are displaced in the context of disaster, but we also have a strong aim to prevent or reduce disaster displacement risk in countries of origin. So very much where we started with the Nansen initiative with a focus on protection. What happened in this strategy, which is maybe a reflection of learning, we have taken out the exclusive focus on cross-border displacement. It's also now covering, it doesn't matter whether it's internal or cross-border. And I think that's important, and it reflects the reality we have heard about. So we have 3 strategic priorities, and I need to run a little quickly, but I want to focus on one of them. So one strategic priority is about the enhanced implementation of measures to protect cross-border disaster displaced persons. So these are policies and action that can happen at the border, how to ensure admission and stay that is safe, predictable, and regular. And I will come back to that as with more details. The second strategic priority is to enhance the management of the risk of disaster displacement in climate change action, disaster risk reduction, and sustainable development. And these are measures related to what we have heard about, how can we make adaptation planning, having an inclusion to the challenges of mobility, how can disaster risk reduction policies and strategies also include the challenges of displacement, and how we seek better policy integration. And the third strategic priority, which is important to recognize, is that we have decided to support enhanced public policies on planned relocation and on internal displaced persons. So these are specific areas, and I picked up on your point, Ricardo. Planned relocation is an area, so that's going to be important for us going forward. And as I said, we have also stepped up our efforts to be better player on supporting work on internally displaced persons. So if I go back to the first strategic priority, which is about enhanced implementation of measures to protect cross-border disaster displaced persons, I just want to quickly go through 4 areas of work. And this is very much about how we manage international migration, how we manage international displacement, and what need to happen at the border so people can seek admission and stay and have more predictable conditions for their stay and eventual return. So there are 4 sub areas around enhancing the protection of cross-border disaster displaced people. One is enhanced availability and flexibility of pathways for regular migration for persons at risk of or affected by disasters and adverse effect of climate change. And this is very much about giving support to the implementation of the Global Compact for Migration and some of the policy instruments that states have already signed up to make sure that there are more pathways available for people, whether it's related to the climate change, environmental degradation, or disaster. But more broadly speaking, we need more pathways. And there are tools we can use to remind states about their commitment to create and build more pathways. The second area is around the promotion on use of humanitarian visa and temporary protection schemes. And that's important. Many countries do have provision for temporary protection and humanitarian visa. And how can we support its more predictable use and also harmonization? And some work we have been doing is to run simulation exercise with states, for example. So people, or at least states and the relevant institution, have an experience on how do you deal with, for example, sudden influx, or how do you deal with this situation. The third area, and I cannot really go into the details of this, is not to forget refugee law, not to forget binding standards related to human rights law and its applicability, or their applicability when it comes to cross-border movement. So we turn very often to Andrew and colleagues, and also to seek what can we actually use when it also comes to regional instruments such as the Refugee Convention in Africa and the Cartagena Declaration in the Americas. And the fourth area around cross-border movement is the development of regional human mobility frameworks. And there are some promising examples from the Pacific just recently, a climate mobility framework. We have mobility frameworks in South and Central America, and we're very committed to use those practices to build capacity at the sub-regional and continental level. So these are my few cents on the strategy of the PDD going forward. What I like with the strategy is that we have a strategy until 2030, which is not a coincidence. It's about aligning it when a new development or sustainable development system will be developed. And we look forward to work with everyone. And I think Seek said something about this is the moment to really use all the progress that has been made, Scott, since 2013 with the Peninsula Principles, all the progress that has been made through 2 global compacts, the Senda framework, and some of the interesting development we see under the Climate Change Convention on loss and damage. So thank you so much for this great event. And I learned and listened very carefully to everyone. So thank you to my fellow panelists also.
Great. Thank you very much, Atle. And congratulations again on building up PDD into the powerhouse institution that it is today. I know that's not very easy task to do. So well done there. Well, of all the things you said, one thing that pops in my mind, maybe for your plan 2030 to 2040, because probably too late to get it in the new one, but the significance of in terms of, I know you're going to branch off more into the internal displacement dimensions now than the cross-border stuff, but time will show, obviously, that cross-border will increase. So, don't forget that one. But for a very significant series of legal cases took place in New Zealand and then in Geneva relating to this issue, right? The Taitiota case, which obviously had the end result in creating really important legal precedent in terms of applying the non-refoulement principle to questions of potential danger relating to return of somebody who was seeking asylum because of climate conditions in their original location. So, it brings up the bigger issue of perhaps the next stage in that. It's perhaps something that PDD could be involved in, is trying to push the boundaries of that legal right even further, to the point of not just non-refoulement, but the duty of all recipient states to have mechanisms in place to actually be able to coherently address climate displacement causation behind the potential migration / asylum / refugee claim, because that will just happen more and more. And if we can just get one, crystal clear precedent-setting case that says at the very least you have to have mechanisms in place to deal with this aside from normal asylum procedures and the expertise in order to manage it, the world will be just that much better prepared to deal with this question. Because unfortunately, the Taitiota case, I know all about the origins of it in great detail, but it was very far from ideal, in terms of the actual case that went forward. The factual elements of that case were really flawed. The guy had put forth a whole series of asylum claims before, and it was really a last-ditch effort by a kind of radical lawyer, and said, well, just argue climate change, so it wasn't a crystal clear case. So if you ever do pursue this path, make sure the case you choose is crystal clear, one person who's from a village where you can literally show the village no longer exists, and that's why they sought asylum in a third country. We're trying to do the same thing with the case I mentioned earlier that we're working on now, a positive obligation case in terms of HLP stuff. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, can I come back in on that? Excellent. So that we are supported with some strong legal minds in
Sure.
our inner circles,
Sure,
Professor
totally.
Walter Keeling and Judge Bruce Burson in New Zealand. So that's,
Yeah.
I couldn't go into the details of that, I said, but that's clearly, I'll send you the strategy. That is an area of potential opportunity. So very happy
Excellent.
to work with you on that. So thank you.
Oh, great. Okay, that's fantastic. Yeah, because we're trying to explore the the barrister side, so not just the judge side, legal law professor side, but also the best of the best barristers. But we're in the process now of finding the ideal case. And we have like 30 potential ones, but so far we haven't found the perfect one. And we're trying to narrow it down. But I think, it's kind of these strategic litigation like that can get us in one case, 10 years ahead. It can jump us 10 years ahead of time instead of letting it just occur, organically. And I think PDD, because of its structure, the fact that it is state-based, that, it has a, growing reputation, could be really a crucial, linchpin in that quest to achieve that. Yeah. So just because we're going over, so thank you again, Atle, and thank you, everybody. Does anybody have any comments? Well, I see that Florine is there. She hasn't said anything at all. She wasn't really on the agenda, but if you want to say anything, Florine, you certainly may.
No, thanks, Scott. I think Atle covered everything for the PDD, but on the point of strategic litigation, I think the advisory opinion coming out of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights will also be quite interesting, specifically on the issue of climate displacement. So I think that's something to look out for this year.
I just wanted to pick up on some points, because the idea that climate change is a threat multiplier is so important. I know Jim talked about it a bit, but that in a way, I think, I know that for the legal reasons, there is this attempt to kind of make a case for climate refugees specifically. But there are so many people who are economic refugees, but when you talk to them about why they moved, a little bit about Ricardo's research, for example, when he was saying people were moving for jobs or economic reason, the underlying reason quite often, especially in like Latin America, South America, they've moved from rural areas because it was impossible to have a job. Like, they've moved for economic reasons. So they're economic migrants or urban migrants, but effectively they're climate migrants. So I wonder if that's something, a bit provocative, but should we even be defining climate refugees, or should we just be talking about this need to absolutely rethink mobility, human mobility, and removing this barrier? I mean, climate at the moment, immigration is dealt with primarily by Home Office, or it's dealt with as a security issue, but it's not. It's an economic issue primarily, and also a humanitarian issue. And we should be removing, in my opinion, it's impossible anyway to completely say we don't want any immigration, but we should be removing barriers and working out strategies within policy frameworks, within national and international and bilateral agreements, etc., to make migration and human mobility much easier, safer, and a completely normalized part of society, so that takes one huge barrier away from people who are facing climate destruction, because it is, this is environmental degradation, whether it's climate change or as Jim was mentioning, other things. So I'm thinking that moving that on. And I would also say, one of the big threats, which Ricardo touched on, is that we do face this situation where, as migration, because of demographic decline and everything, in rich societies becomes more normalized, and people are desperate to bring people in, it becomes the educated middle class people who can move, and then there is the left behind people who are the most vulnerable and who can't afford to move and who are stuck. And so that's where we should be looking as well. And people stuck, and that is domestically as well. Within internal migration, they're stuck in uninsurable homes, right? Because they're then trapped because they can't sell those homes. No one's going to want to buy them. They can't afford to move anywhere safer. And meanwhile, their town and economic prospects are declining because everyone's moving away. And these depopulating places, whether it's for climate or other, they're stuck. So strategies in place. And I would just lastly say that when we're talking about climate disasters and evacuation of refugees, that is a failure of planning policy, because it's very rare that people are evacuated because of a extreme weather disaster that could never have been predicted, right? We know where the most vulnerable places are, and the reason for these evacuations is because we haven't put in strategies to, when they're evacuated and then allowed back, as Bangladesh has been very successful in that policy, for example, because of typhoons and warnings and everything. But in a lot of places, we haven't worked out ways of managing and the policy to help people move to livable, dignified livelihoods elsewhere, and so they're being evacuated, and that is a failure. We should be getting beyond the need to evacuate at the last minute. It should be a much more planned migration.
If it's also possible, if we can sort of avoid using the word threat multiplier, because like what we're talking about is displacement. We're talking about people on the move, and there's already people trying to exaggerate the threats of people on the move, and that's leading to this sort of like, again, walls being built, xenophobic, almost.
Yeah, so I meant not threats to other people.
I know, but what I would like to try
they're
and
more
sort of
likely.
have is more like. Let me finish, please. What I would like to have is more of a focus on the vulnerability of the populations. So, like the use of vulnerability multiplier, that it's not the populations that's at fault here. They're not a threat. There's circumstances which are being imposed upon them from the outside of their area, and they're being made more vulnerable. And what we need to be doing is trying to support their adaptation and building their resilience. So moving away from that threat to the vulnerability, something which I think is, as a collective, we have to be doing. And sort of like, I also avoid trying to use numbers wherever possible, because no one really knows. And even if you look at what the World Bank came out with their groundswell report, there's challenges with that. It's not looking at conflict. It's only looking at IDPs. So if we want to get a profile, you talk about big numbers, and people will. But that also feeds into an increasing xenophobic environment globally, which we need to sort of like mitigate as much as possible, because there are basically 40,000 people per day who are crossing borders, who are being displaced, even under UNHCR's mandate. In like, that's a lot of people, and so we need to be trying to, when we're talking about scale, when we're talking about understanding what should be the appropriate responses, it can't be responsive. We need to be anticipating that there's going to be millions of people displaced in the future unless we do A, B, or C. So we need to give people options about what is the future going to hold. This is where having a much more a collaborative approach. The wording in terms of climate refugees, we're obviously there's a lot to be discussed about that, because, as we've all said, the vast majority of people do not cross an international border. So that's one thing. So the other issue is that many states do not want to see their citizens as refugees, because they're saying it's not our fault that people have been forced from Tuvalu, from Kiribati. We're trying to do whatever we can. So don't give us this moniker that we're persecuting or discriminating people. So we've got to be a little bit careful about that. And like, the default should be what the TFD and UNFCCC is using as under human mobility. Like, there is migration, there is displacement, and there is planned relocation. So rather than sort of trying to complicate things, let's just try and use what's existing there and make sure that the understanding of what fits into those different elements are taken into account.
Yeah, I mean, I agree on the words. So I meant threat to the people that were moving, obviously, but the word threat is quite loaded. So possibly risk multiplier, but or whatever. But it's, the problem is they are all so very interconnected, and people are, people move from rural areas to the city when they can't afford bread prices or wheat prices because of drought, and then causes conflict there. And what is the root cause? But that idea that human mobility is something that we should accommodate and try and assist these people rather than the specific label, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's important to, for us to also not at all neglect the political dimension of migration, right? In particular, the era that we're living in, like whether we like it or not, these people are used as the scapegoats for extreme right-wing policies, which are most certainly and tragically on the ascendancy, right? So we need, I think, collectively, everybody who understands the true nature of these issues really needs to, put together convincing arguments to skeptics that, there's a reason every single person who's from an EU country, unlike you now, Gaia, thanks to Brexit. Yeah, exactly. But you have the legal right to live and reside in any of the other 27 countries tomorrow if you want, but less than 5% of the people have done it. So it's going to, this fear mongering that suddenly hordes are going to come and arrive everywhere if we have slightly more flexible migration policies really need to be, nipped in the bud in terms of policies. On the flip side, in the world we live in today, most people don't realize it, but 35 countries are selling nationalities. They're selling citizenship. 35 different countries tomorrow. If you have enough money in your bank account, you can go straight to the embassy of Dominica, put down $100,000, and you are a citizen of Dominica. You put down 125,000, you're a citizen of St. Kitts and Nevis, and there's 33 others that allow you to do that. So there's conceptually, many countries have already really fully accepted the idea that citizenship is in fact not at all tied to where you're from or who your parents are or where you're living now. It's a matter of a commercial transaction, which opens up, as bad as that is in some ways, on other hands, it opens up a whole slew of arguments in our favor that says, if you're able to allow that, then why aren't you able to allow refugees plus normal economic migrants plus who go through the front door plus the ones that are increasingly coming in the back door. Ricardo has had his hand up for so long, it must be aching now.
Thanks, Scott. I just wanted to respond quickly to Andrew and then just follow up on what Gaia was saying. I completely agree, Andrew, that with the numbers, and usually they don't really add up. And I remember, I think it was Norman Myers that once discussed that, his own calculations were sort of in the back of the envelope kind of thing. And it's incredibly difficult to assess really the numbers of people that will be displaced internally, let alone internationally. So I think the focus, and I think the research community is shifting towards understanding really the underlying factors, as Guy was saying, the extent to which people then move because of environmental stressors, even though they themselves don't identify as climate migrants or so on. But one point I just wanted to pick up on that was that immobility. And I think the guy you were talking about, sort of the trapped populations, there's two camps that discuss this, either it's immobility or trapped. Anyway, but I'm pleased to hear, Atle, that the PDD is kind of really moving into the planned relocation circles or putting more emphasis into that. Because the ability to migrate is influenced by a wide range of intersecting social factors, life course transitions, and so on. So we're likely, especially really, I guess, in global south, the countries that are more exposed to severe, extreme weather events, that they will not be able to move voluntarily. They won't have the capacity nor the resources. So these interventions by governments are likely to become more relevant in the future. And I think many of those countries don't have the financial capacity, the structure. Some of those, from examples of our research, institutions don't really speak to each other. There's no framework that guides plan. There's a lot of international frameworks on planned relocation, but on the ground, sort of at the local level, those that are really deploying and making those policy come to fruition are not necessarily really guided by frameworks that look at distributive justice, procedural justice, mechanisms for complaint, and so on. So I think it is really important that we look at sort of those that are immobile, and we'll really rely on support from institutions and governments.
Yeah, and that very much raises the issue of, when we mention planned relocation, it sounds so nice, it sounds so easy, and you just set up this plan and the poor, decrepit people get to move from point A to point B. The bottom line is it almost never works, right? And it can be so easily manipulated by, once again, nefarious powers as a way of getting rid of people from a valuable piece of coastal property, for instance. And we have experience working with Ursula Rakova and the people of the Carteret Islands, for years, 20 years now. they had the most elaborate plans in place to move everybody from the Carterets onto Bougainville and start life over. And we were actually involved in putting together what was meant to be the world's first big land deal to benefit climate displaced people, but it all fell apart because, you know, the money went missing basically. But even there, where the few families that have moved from the Carteret Islands onto Bougainville, many have returned to really, really bad conditions, you know? So it must have been so bad on Bougainville to force them to go back. And that you have that sort of phenomenon too, even in Fiji now, that what is it? I think it's 48 communities that have been self-identified as needing relocation. And the first 2 or 3 are, you know, underway or completed. And even those are having troubles. You know, even the very first one, Vananueloga, I think is how you pronounce it. They only moved, I think, a kilometer up a hill, basically. So they were very adjacent to their former homes. It wasn't like moving to another island like Ontong Java will have to do. And they just found they could not pull their boats high enough up the hill to feel safe that their boats wouldn't be stolen in the middle of the night, just 500 meters away. So even at that, you know, minuscule level, it's really hard. But going back to the beginning of that whole equation of planned relocation, you know, the way we partially look at it is the duty of the state, at the very least, to diagnose where you are going to have the most likelihood of climate displacement. Every government in the world has, to some degree, that capacity. They can know which neighborhoods, which slums, which villages are at the highest risk based on history and a whole range of other things. So at the very least, you have to diagnose where the problem is going to occur first, and then start working with those communities. Most countries have not done that. I mean, NGOs like Climate Central have thousands and thousands of pages of maps, which show, you know, vulnerable coastlines. But, you know, the world has 365,000 kilometers of coastline. And the vast majority of that is neither protected with infrastructure, as in 99.9%. And I'd say well under 90% has adequately had diagnostic work carried out to the degree that's needed in order to provide sort of permanent, long-term HLP solutions to their current plight. So it sounds so nice, and, you know, we've worked on it specifically, but it's so hard to implement. I mean, it's the same in the development circles of, you know, involuntary resettlement for World Bank projects and stuff. They never work. You know, I mean, do you think the relocation of Dharavi in Mumbai right now is going to succeed? No way. You know, it never works. So that's kind of one of the dilemmas that we face, that, you know, we want the best for these communities, obviously, and they want to go somewhere where they can reestablish themselves in a viable, you know, and prosperous manner. But there's a reason that people feel connected to their land, you know, and if we start weaving in the whole indigenous question and the relationship of indigenous people to land, then it really gets complicated. I mean, are you going to really argue that these people should leave their ancestors behind and move to someone else's land when land is not at all a commercial commodity? It's a part of you as a human, you know, with 10-20% of the world's population is indigenous. So we're talking about a problem affecting, you know, hundreds of millions of people. So it's very, very, you know, for none of us, there's no real blueprint per se. You know, I mean, we can argue human rights and we can argue, you know, justice and loss and damage and, you know, prosperity and equality and non-discrimination and peace and love and harmony. Totally awesome things all the way. But really doing it in a way that fully and completely recognizes the complexities and the completeness of humans is a very big challenge.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure meeting you all and talking about these great issues. It's brilliant to know so many good minds are working on it.
Well, thank you for coming, and bye everyone.